It was a cool autumn evening, the kind that hinted at the coming chill of winter but still carried the last remnants of summer warmth. The leaves crunched underfoot, the wind whispered through the trees, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo, dotted with stars that flickered like distant candles. It was the perfect night for a sleepover, or so we thought. We were in my friend Lily's house, an old Victorian that had been in her family for generations. It was the kind of house that had seen better days, with creaking floorboards, high ceilings, and windows that rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up. But it was cozy in its own way, with a lived-in charm that made it feel like home. There were 5 of us that night. Me, Lily, Sophie, Jess, and Emily. We were all gathered in Lily's living room, sprawled out on sleeping bags and blankets, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the walls. A bowl of popcorn sat on the coffee table, half empty, and the remnants of our pizza dinner were scattered across the room. We had just finished watching a horror movie, something about a haunted house and a vengeful spirit, and the atmosphere in the room was electric with that nervous, jittery energy that comes after a good scare. We were all a little on edge, giggling nervously at every creak and groan the house made, but it was the kind of fear that felt safe, controlled. We were in Lily's house, after all, a place we knew inside and out. What could possibly go wrong? My name is Sarah, and I've known Lily since we were kids. We grew up on the same street, went to the same schools, and shared countless sleepovers, just like this one. Lily's house had always been our go-to spot for these nights of laughter and scary stories. There was something about her home, the way it felt like a living entity with its creaks and whispers, that made it the perfect setting for a night of spooky fun. Lily was the bravest of us all. She had this fearless streak, a kind of reckless curiosity that led us into more than a few questionable situations over the years. But she was also the one who would always find a way to get us out of trouble, her quick thinking and sharp wit turning potential disasters into nothing more than funny stories we'd laugh about later. Sophie was the sensitive one, always in tune with the emotions of those around her. She had a way of knowing when something was wrong before anyone else did, a kind of sixth sense that made her our unofficial emotional compass. Jess was the skeptic, the one who never believed in anything unless she could see it with her own eyes. She was logical to a fault, always looking for the rational explanation, even when it wasn't there. And then there was Emily, the storyteller, the one who could spin a tale so vivid and terrifying that it would keep us up all night, jumping at every shadow. As for me, I guess I was the glue that held us all together. I wasn't the bravest or the smartest or the most creative, but I was the one who kept everyone grounded, who made sure that no matter what happened, we stuck together. We were a tight-knit group, the kind of friends who knew each other's secrets and fears, who had been through thick and thin together. This sleepover was supposed to be like any other, a night of junk food, scary movies, and staying up way too late talking about boys and school and everything in between. But as the night wore on, it became clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary sleepover. It started with the noises, small, barely noticeable at first, like the house was settling in for the night. A creak here, a groan there, nothing unusual for an old house like Lily's. But as the night went on, the noises became harder to ignore. They were sharper, more deliberate, like footsteps echoing in the empty rooms upstairs. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her eyes wide as she looked toward the ceiling. "Hear what?" Jess asked, her voice steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "It's just the house," Lily said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "This place makes all kinds of weird noises at night." We all listened for a moment, the room falling into an uneasy silence. And then we heard it, another creak, this time louder, as if someone was walking down the hallway upstairs. "Maybe it's your parents," I suggested, though I knew they were out of town for the weekend. Lily had the house to herself, which was why we had decided to have the sleepover in the first place. "They won't be back until tomorrow," Lily said, her voice tight. We exchanged nervous glances, the tension in the room thickening. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a cold shiver running down my spine. There was something off about those noises, something that didn't feel right. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jess said, trying to sound confident. "Old houses make weird noises. It's probably just the wind." But as she spoke, the lights flickered, just for a moment, but enough to send a wave of unease through all of us. The TV screen flashed static before settling back on the movie we were watching, and the shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, more menacing. "Okay, that was weird," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. We all nodded, the nervous laughter that usually followed moments like this conspicuously absent. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to make its move. "I think we should check it out," Lily said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight from the coffee table. "Are you serious?" Sophie asked, her voice high-pitched with fear. "What if there's someone up there?" "Then we'll deal with it," Lily said, her tone firm. "We can't just sit here and do nothing." Reluctantly, we all got to our feet, the fear in the pit of my stomach growing with each step. We followed Lily out of the living room and into the hallway, the creaking floorboards beneath our feet only adding to the sense of unease. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls as we made our way toward the stairs. The house was eerily silent now, the only sound the soft hum of the flashlight and our own ragged breathing. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the stillness, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, Lily paused, her hand on the banister. She looked back at us, her expression a mix of determination and fear. "Stay close," she whispered, and then she started up the stairs. We followed her, our footsteps echoing in the empty house. The stairs creaked with each step, the sound reverberating through the hallway like a warning. My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear growing with each step we took. When we reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before us, dark and foreboding. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed, the shadows deepening as the flashlight beam swept across them. "Which room?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's start with my parents' room," Lily said, her voice trembling slightly. We moved toward the door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to her parents' bedroom. The door was closed, but as we got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a light shining from underneath the door, a soft, flickering glow that made my heart skip a beat. "Was that light on before?" I asked, my voice shaky. Lily shook her head, her face pale in the dim light. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't." We all stared at the door, the fear in the pit of my stomach growing into a full-blown panic. There was something behind that door, something that wasn't supposed to be there. "Should we open it?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Lily hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. And then, with a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. At least that's what I told myself at first. The light we had seen was coming from a small lamp on the bedside table, its soft glow casting long shadows across the room. But there was no one there, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the dark space beyond. My heart skipped a beat, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "Maybe it's nothing," Jess said, her voice shaky. "Maybe the wind blew it open." But as she spoke, the closet door creaked open a little further, as if something inside was pushing it open. We all froze, our eyes locked on the dark space beyond the door. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, the air thick with tension. And then, slowly, a figure stepped out of the closet. It was a man, tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the dim light. His eyes were sunken and hollow, his hair matted and unkempt. He was dressed in ragged clothes, his body hunched over as if he was in pain. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most, cold, empty eyes that seemed to bore into my soul, eyes that held no trace of humanity. We all stared at him, too terrified to move, too terrified to speak. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching us with those cold, dead eyes. And then, without warning, he lunged at us. We screamed and stumbled back, our fear turning to pure panic. The man's movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He reached out with one hand, his fingers twisted and gnarled, trying to grab hold of us. Lily reacted first, swinging the flashlight at him with all her strength. The beam of light hit him square in the chest, and for a moment he seemed to dissolve into the shadows, his form flickering and wavering like a mirage. But he didn't disappear. He reformed in front of us, his face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Run," Lily shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. We bolted out of the room, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The man's footsteps followed us, slow and deliberate, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. We ran down the stairs, the sound of our pounding footsteps filling the house. The man was right behind us, his presence like a dark cloud, suffocating and oppressive. We reached the front door, our hands fumbling with the lock in our panic. I could feel the man's cold breath on the back of my neck, his fingers brushing against my skin. And then, just as I thought we were doomed, the door flew open, and we tumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, the darkness outside a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we finally stopped, we looked back at the house, expecting to see the man standing in the doorway, watching us with those cold, dead eyes. But the house was dark and silent, the front door closed as if nothing had happened. We stood there for a moment, our bodies trembling with fear and adrenaline, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Was that real?" Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Lily said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to go back in there." None of us did. We spent the rest of the night at Sophie's house, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to go back to Lily's house. It's been months since that night, and I still can't get it out of my mind. We never talked about it again, never went back to Lily's house. Her parents sold the place a few weeks later, and we all moved on with our lives. But the memory of that night still haunts me. I can still see the man's cold, dead eyes, still feel the chill of his breath on my skin. And sometimes in the dead of night, I can hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer. I don't know what we saw that night or what it meant, but I do know one thing: I'll never forget it. My name is Sarah, and if you had met me a year ago, you would have thought I was just like anyone else, ordinary, grounded, and rational to a fault. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, a place where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever really happened. My childhood was what most would consider normal, filled with summers spent biking through the neighborhood, playing tag with the kids on my block, and cozying up with my parents and younger brother Mark during the cold winters. After high school, I went off to college in New York, eager to experience the world beyond the quiet streets of my hometown. I studied psychology, fascinated by the complexities of the human mind and how it works. That's what I was focused on, understanding people, behavior, and the intricacies of our thoughts and feelings. I wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural or the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, and haunted dolls were things of fiction, meant for movies and campfire stories, not for real life. After college, I moved back home for a while. I had found a job at a local clinic, helping people work through their issues and offering them a safe space to talk. Life was calm, predictable, even mundane. I'd visit my parents regularly, and Mark, who was about to finish high school, would often pop by my small apartment downtown. We were a close-knit family, the kind you'd find in any small town across America. My parents still lived in the house we grew up in, a cozy two-story place with a big backyard and a white picket fence. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours. They'd been there since before I was born, and the house was filled with memories, some happy, some sad, but all cherished. They were the kind of parents who held on to things, who kept mementos of every little milestone. The attic was full of boxes packed with old photos, school projects, and toys from when Mark and I were kids. It was a treasure trove of nostalgia. And that's where it all started, in the attic of my parents' house, among the dust and cobwebs, where time seemed to stand still. It was a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day where the air is crisp, but the sun still holds a bit of warmth. I had decided to visit my parents for the weekend. We had lunch together, and afterward I found myself wandering into the attic. It had been years since I'd last ventured up there, and I thought it might be fun to take a trip down memory lane, maybe even find something worth bringing back to my apartment. The attic was just as I remembered, dimly lit, with a single small window that let in a sliver of light. Dust motes floated in the air, dancing in the sunbeam that cut through the darkness. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the smell of old paper and forgotten memories filled the air. I started going through the boxes, pulling out old yearbooks, childhood drawings, and toys that had once been my prized possessions. There were dolls, action figures, board games, and stuffed animals, things I hadn't thought about in years. I smiled as I sifted through them, each item bringing back a flood of memories. And then I found it. It was tucked away in a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old books. A small, dusty box with a faded label that read Sarah's doll. I didn't remember ever having a doll like that, but then again, I had so many toys as a kid that it wasn't surprising I'd forgotten a few. Curious, I pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a doll, about a foot tall, with porcelain skin and big blue eyes. Her blonde hair was neatly styled in ringlets, and she wore a frilly white dress with lace trim. She looked like something out of a Victorian-era nursery, the kind of doll you'd expect to see on display in a glass case. Despite the dust that had settled on her, she was in surprisingly good condition. There was something about her that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to stare straight at me unblinking, or the way her tiny, painted lips were curved into a faint smile that seemed almost too lifelike. But I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere of the attic. I decided to take the doll downstairs and show it to my mom. Maybe she'd remember where it came from, or why I didn't. "Hey, Mom," I called as I descended the creaky stairs, the doll cradled in my arms. "Do you remember this?" My mom was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the doll. "Oh, that old thing," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite place. I didn't realize we still had it. "Where did it come from?" I asked, setting the doll on the kitchen table. My mom hesitated for a moment, her eyes lingering on the doll. "It was a gift from your great aunt Edith," she said finally. "She gave it to you when you were about 5 or 6. You used to play with it all the time." I frowned, trying to dredge up the memory, but came up blank. I don't remember it at all. "Well, you were very young," my mom said, brushing off the subject. "It's been up in the attic for years now. I guess you outgrew it." Something in her tone made me think there was more to the story, but I didn't press. Instead, I picked up the doll again, studying it more closely. There was nothing overtly sinister about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. "I think I'll take her home," I said on impulse. "Maybe she'll look nice on a shelf or something." My mom just nodded, though her expression was unreadable. "Just be careful with it," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's very old." I didn't think much of her words at the time. I took the doll home with me, setting her on a shelf in my living room where she could overlook the space. And that's where things started to get strange. A few days after bringing the doll home, I found myself growing more and more curious about her origins. The fact that I had no memory of her bothered me, and my mom's vague explanation didn't help, so I decided to dig a little deeper. I called my mom again, asking her if she could tell me more about the doll and my great-aunt Edith. I knew Edith had passed away when I was very young, but I didn't know much else about her. "Well, Edith was always a bit eccentric," my mom said over the phone, choosing her words carefully. "She never married, never had children of her own. She was the kind of person who collected things, dolls, antiques, old books. Her house was like a museum, filled with all sorts of oddities. She gave you that doll when we visited her one summer. You were so excited about it. Wouldn't let it out of your sight." "Why don't I remember any of that?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I don't know," Sarah, my mom, replied, sounding distant. "But there was something about that doll. Something that always made me uneasy. After Edith passed away, you stopped playing with it. You just put it away one day and never touched it again. I thought you had forgotten about it, so I packed it up and put it in the attic." "What made you uneasy about it?" I pressed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before my mom spoke again. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just had a feeling. Sometimes I'd hear you talking to it, like it was a real person. And once, I found you crying in your room, clutching the doll like it was the only thing that could comfort you. When I asked you what was wrong, you didn't answer. You just stared at me, as if you didn't even recognize me." A shiver ran down my spine. "I don't remember any of that." "Maybe it's better that way," my mom said quietly. "But now that you've brought it home, just be careful, okay? It's probably just an old toy, but I don't know. Something about it still gives me the creeps." I thanked my mom for the information, but the conversation left me feeling unsettled. What had seemed like an innocent childhood toy now felt like something more, a link to a past I couldn't remember, and didn't necessarily want to. That night, I did some research online, trying to find out more about the doll's origins. It was a long shot, but I figured there might be something out there, a similar doll, a manufacturer, anything that could give me a clue. I spent hours scrolling through websites and forums, looking at pictures of antique dolls, reading about their histories, but I found nothing that matched mine. She was unique, or at least she seemed to be. There was something almost uncanny about her, something that set her apart from the other dolls I saw. And then I stumbled across a forum for doll collectors, a place where enthusiasts shared stories and information about their collections. I decided to post a picture of my doll, asking if anyone recognized her or knew anything about her history. It wasn't long before I got a response. A user named Antique Lover replied to my post, saying the doll looked familiar, like one they had seen in a collection belonging to a woman named Edith, my great-aunt. The message was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. How could someone else know about Edith's doll? I quickly replied, asking for more information, but the user never responded. I checked the forum again the next day, but the post was gone, as if it had never existed. That's when the unexplained occurrences began. It started off subtly, so subtly that I wasn't sure if it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I'd come home from work to find the doll in a slightly different position than I had left her. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had moved her without realizing it. But as the days went on, the changes became more noticeable. One evening, I returned home to find the doll facing the wall, her back to the room. I was certain I hadn't left her like that. I felt a prickle of unease, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had knocked her over and she had fallen into that position. I picked her up, turned her around, and set her back on the shelf. But the unease lingered. That night I had trouble sleeping. My apartment felt different, heavier, darker. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I finally did drift off, my sleep was plagued by strange, disjointed dreams, images of the doll's face, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into my soul. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. It was just a dream, I told myself. But the fear clung to me, making it impossible to fall back asleep. The next day I was exhausted and on edge. At work I couldn't concentrate, my mind constantly drifting back to the doll. I felt silly for being so unnerved by a toy, but I couldn't help it. There was something about her that was getting under my skin, something that felt wrong. When I got home that evening, I found the doll on the floor, lying face down. My first thought was that she had fallen off the shelf, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The shelf wasn't very high, and there were no other objects nearby that could have knocked her off. I picked her up, my hands trembling slightly. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw her mouth twitch into a smile. I dropped her back on the shelf, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, the strange occurrences escalated. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a soft thumping sound coming from the living room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was rhythmic, like something was hitting the floor over and over again. I mustered the courage to get out of bed and crept to the living room, my heart in my throat. The thumping stopped as soon as I entered the room, the silence almost deafening in its intensity. The doll was still on the shelf, her eyes fixed on me. But there was something different about her, something subtle yet undeniable. It was as if her expression had changed, her features twisted into a look of malice. I backed away, my fear turning to full-blown panic. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment with the doll. I grabbed my phone and called Mark, my voice trembling as I asked if I could stay with him for the night. He didn't ask any questions, just told me to come over. I didn't even bother packing a bag. I just grabbed my keys and left, leaving the doll behind. As I drove to Mark's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the doll's eyes were still on me, even from miles away. I spent the night at Mark's, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face, her eyes staring into mine, her mouth curling into a malevolent grin. I couldn't escape her, even in my dreams. The next morning I told Mark everything, the doll, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched. He listened quietly, his expression serious. When I was done, he suggested we go back to my apartment together and get rid of the doll. We arrived at my apartment around noon. The place felt different, colder, darker, as if the very air had turned heavy with dread. I led Mark to the living room, where the doll still sat on the shelf, her eyes fixed on the spot where I had been standing the night before. Mark walked over to the doll, his brow furrowed. "There's something off about this," he muttered, picking her up and examining her closely. "It's just a doll, but what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "But it feels wrong. Like there's something inside it, something alive." A shiver ran down my spine at his words. "What do we do?" "Let's get rid of it," he said, his voice firm. "We'll take it to the dump or burn it, whatever it takes. We just need to get it out of here." We decided to drive out to the edge of town, where there was an old, abandoned lot that people sometimes used to dispose of unwanted junk. It was isolated, far enough away that no one would see us. As we drove, the atmosphere in the car grew heavier, the air thick with an oppressive energy. I could feel the doll's presence, even though it was wrapped in a cloth and stuffed in the trunk. It was as if she was seeping into the very fabric of reality, warping the world around her. When we arrived at the lot, Mark pulled the car to a stop and got out. I followed, my legs shaky with fear. We opened the trunk, and Mark hesitated for a moment before reaching in and grabbing the doll. The cloth had come loose, revealing her porcelain face, her eyes staring up at him with that same malevolent gaze. He carried her to a pile of old, broken furniture and discarded appliances. Without a word, he set her down on the ground, and we both stepped back, as if expecting her to come to life and attack us. "Let's burn it," Mark said, his voice low. He pulled a lighter from his pocket and handed it to me. "You do it." I took the lighter with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to get any closer to the doll, but I knew it had to be done. I stepped forward, flicked the lighter, and held the flame to the doll's dress. The fabric caught fire quickly, the flames spreading up the doll's body. As the fire consumed her, I could have sworn I heard a faint, high-pitched scream, like the wail of a dying animal. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The flames grew higher, engulfing the doll completely. The porcelain cracked and shattered, the once innocent face twisting into a grotesque mask of agony. The scream grew louder, more piercing, until it was almost unbearable. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The flames died down, leaving nothing but a pile of ash and shattered porcelain. I stood there, staring at the remnants of the doll, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the scream? Had it all been some twisted nightmare? Mark placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's over," he said quietly. "Let's go." We got back in the car and drove away from the lot, leaving the ashes of the doll behind. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over, that the doll's presence still lingered, somewhere just beyond the edge of my consciousness. It's been months since that day, and I still don't feel like myself. I've tried to move on, to put the experience behind me, but it haunts me like a shadow I can't escape. I see the doll's face in my nightmares, hear her scream in the silence of the night. I've thrown myself into my work, trying to lose myself in the routines of daily life, but the memories are always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I've become paranoid, jumpy, afraid of the dark. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind, sends a jolt of fear through me. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just a doll, just an old toy with no real power. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was something evil in that doll, something that defied explanation. And even though it's gone, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, watching, biding its time. I don't talk about it with anyone, not even Mark. He's moved on, but I can't. I'm trapped in a loop, reliving that day over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of something that can't be understood. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be free of it, if I'll ever be able to live my life without the shadow of that doll hanging over me. But deep down, I fear the answer is no. The past is never truly gone, and some things are better left forgotten. But I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. And so I live with the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that some things are beyond our understanding. There's something about sleepovers that always felt magical when I was younger. A night of staying up late, watching scary movies and gossiping with friends until the early hours of the morning. This time it was no different. My friends and I had gathered at Rachel's house for a weekend sleepover. We were all excited her parents were out of town, leaving us the whole house to ourselves. Rachel's house was tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was one of those large, old houses that seemed to creak and groan with the weight of its history. The perfect setting for a spooky night in. We had settled in the living room, blankets and pillows strewn across the floor, popcorn bowls and soda cans littering every available surface. The glow of the television cast eerie shadows on the walls as we watched an old horror movie, one of those low-budget, cult classics that was more funny than frightening. It was past midnight when the phone rang. We all jumped at the sound, startled by the sudden intrusion. Rachel paused the movie, and we exchanged nervous glances, our earlier laughter dying down. I remember the look on Rachel's face as she reached for the cordless phone on the coffee table. Her hand trembled slightly, but she forced a smile as she brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice wavering. There was a long pause, and I could see Rachel's expression change from confusion to something darker, unease, maybe even fear. The room was silent as we watched her, the tension thick in the air. "Who is this?" Rachel asked, her voice a little stronger this time. Another pause. Then, without another word, she hung up the phone, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, breaking the silence. Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide. "It was just static," she said, her voice shaky. No one said anything, just static. We all laughed it off, trying to shake off the weirdness. Prank calls weren't uncommon, especially when you're a bunch of teenagers staying up late. But something about Rachel's expression stuck with me, a hint of dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. "My name is Victoria, and I'm just your average high school student. I've always been more of a homebody, preferring books and movies to parties and social gatherings. But Rachel was my best friend, and when she invited me to the sleepover, I couldn't say no. We'd been friends since elementary school, and though we'd grown apart a bit in recent years, our bond was still strong. Rachel was the outgoing one, always the center of attention, with her easy smile and infectious laugh. She was the type of girl who could make friends with anyone, and she often pulled me along on her adventures, pushing me out of my comfort zone. Then there was Angie, the third member of our trio. Angie was quiet, almost shy, but she had a dry sense of humor that always caught you off guard. She was the glue that held us together, balancing out Rachel's extroverted nature and my introverted tendencies. We'd been planning this sleepover for weeks. It was meant to be a way to reconnect, to recapture the fun we used to have before the pressures of high school started pulling us in different directions. We spent the evening like we always did, talking about school, boys, and our plans for the future. It was comfortable, familiar, a much-needed break from the chaos of our daily lives. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere started to shift. that phone call was the first crack in the veneer of normalcy, a hint that something wasn't quite right. We all felt it, even if we didn't say it out loud. There was an unspoken understanding between us that night. Something strange was happening, and we were all in it together. Rachel's parents were the type who often left town on business trips, leaving Rachel to fend for herself. She didn't mind. In fact, she seemed to thrive on the independence. Her house was big, almost too big for just her and her parents. It had that old, lived-in feel, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't the first time we'd stayed over at Rachel's place, but it was the first time we had the house entirely to ourselves. We'd planned the sleepover around a horror movie marathon. It was something we used to do all the time when we were younger, stay up late, scare ourselves silly, and then spend the rest of the night trying to calm each other down. But we were older now, more jaded. We knew the tricks, the jump scares, the predictable plot twists. We weren't so easily frightened anymore. At least that's what we thought. The night had started off like any other. We ordered pizza, raided Rachel's pantry for snacks, and settled in for the movies. We laughed at the cheesy dialogue, rolled our eyes at the over-the-top gore, and made fun of the characters' poor decisions. It was all in good fun, a way to escape the stresses of school and life, if only for a few hours. But that phone call changed everything. After Rachel hung up the phone, we tried to brush it off as a prank. But as the night went on, the atmosphere grew heavier, the tension more palpable. We resumed our movie marathon, but the mood had shifted. Every little noise, every creak of the house, made us jumpy. Even the movie we were watching, once just a source of cheap thrills, now seemed more sinister. And then the phone rang again. This time we all froze. No one made a move to answer it. The ringing seemed to go on forever, echoing through the quiet house, each shrill tone sending a jolt of fear through us. Finally, Angie, who had been the most composed of us all, reached out and grabbed the phone. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We watched her, holding our breath, as she listened. Her face remained expressionless, but I could see the color draining from her cheeks. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly lowered the phone, her hand trembling. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Angie looked at us, her eyes wide with fear. "It's just static," she said, her voice hollow. But there was something else, a voice, I think, buried in the static. It was saying something, but I couldn't make it out. Rachel took the phone from her, pressing it to her ear. She listened for a few seconds before hanging up, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "This isn't funny anymore," she said, trying to sound brave but failing miserably. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the TV. The phone calls had shaken us, brought a sense of unease that we couldn't shake. But we tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank, a coincidence, anything to keep the fear at bay. We tried to laugh it off, to pretend we weren't scared. Rachel suggested we turn off the phone for the night, but that idea didn't sit well with any of us. What if it was something important? What if one of our parents needed to reach us? So we left the phone on, its presence a silent reminder of the calls we'd received. We tried to distract ourselves with more movies, but the fun was gone. Every time the phone rang in the movie, we flinched. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise more sinister. But still, we told ourselves it was nothing. Just a prank, maybe a wrong number. After all, what else could it be? As the night wore on, we grew more and more paranoid. Angie kept glancing at the phone, as if expecting it to ring again at any moment. Rachel tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes. And me? I was just trying to keep it together, to not let my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, that instinctual sense that danger was near. It was the same feeling I'd get when walking home alone at night, that creeping sense of being watched, of not being alone. And then, the phone rang again. This time, none of us moved. We just stared at it, the ringing cutting through the silence like a knife. Finally, Rachel reached out and picked up the phone, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Hello," she said, her voice barely audible. There was a long pause, and then Rachel's eyes widened in horror. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, backing away from it with a look of pure terror on her face. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel didn't answer, just pointed at the phone, her face pale as a ghost. Angie picked it up, and after a few seconds she hung up, her face just as white. It was our names, Angie said, her voice trembling. Someone was saying our names over and over again, mixed in with the static. It sounded wrong, distorted, like they were trying to mimic a voice but couldn't quite get it right. That was the breaking point. We were no longer just scared, we were terrified. This wasn't a prank, it wasn't a coincidence. Something was happening, something we couldn't explain, and we were right in the middle of it. We huddled together on the couch, clutching our blankets as if they could protect us from whatever was out there. The phone sat on the coffee table, silent now, but it felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to go off at any moment. "What do we do?" Angie asked, her voice small and frightened. "I don't know," Rachel admitted, her bravado completely gone. "Maybe we should call the police." "And tell them what I said," my voice trembling. "That we're getting weird phone calls? They'll just tell us it's a prank, or that it's nothing to worry about." "But it's not nothing," Rachel snapped, her fear turning to anger. "Someone out there knows our names, they're watching us. There." She was cut off by the phone ringing again, the sound so sudden and loud that we all screamed. Rachel reached for the phone, but I grabbed her hand, stopping her. "Don't answer it," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever this is, it's trying to scare us. We can't let it." We stared at the phone, its ringing relentless, echoing through the room. It felt like an eternity before it finally stopped, the silence that followed almost as deafening as the ringing had been. We sat in silence for a long time, too scared to move, too scared to speak. The phone didn't ring again, but that didn't bring us any comfort. The damage had been done. We were all on edge, jumping at every little sound, every shadow. The sleepover had turned into a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "We need to stay together," she said, her voice shaky. "No one goes anywhere alone, not even to the bathroom. We stay here together until morning." We all agreed, not that we had much choice. We were too scared to do anything else. So we sat there, huddled together on the couch, waiting for the night to end. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We didn't sleep, didn't talk, just sat there, waiting for something to happen. Every noise, every creak of the house sent us into a panic, but nothing ever came. The phone didn't ring again, and by the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we were all exhausted, physically and mentally. But the fear didn't go away with the daylight. It lingered, a heavy presence that clung to us, reminding us of what had happened. We were no longer the carefree teenagers we had been just hours before. Something had changed, something inside us had broken, and we couldn't put it back together. We never talked about what happened that night, not really. We tried to move on, to pretend it was just a bad dream, but it wasn't that simple. The fear had taken root, and it wouldn't let go. We stopped having sleepovers, stopped staying up late to watch horror movies. The things that had once brought us joy now filled us with dread. And then the nightmares started. They were always the same. We were back at Rachel's house, sitting on the couch, the phone ringing endlessly, but no one would answer it. We just sat there, paralyzed with fear, knowing that whatever was on the other end of the line was coming for us. I started avoiding Rachel and Angie, unable to face them without being reminded of that night. We drifted apart, our friendship slowly crumbling under the weight of what had happened. I don't know if they had the same nightmares, if they were as haunted by that night as I was, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. Eventually, we went our separate ways, leaving that part of our lives behind. But the fear never really went away. It stayed with me, a constant reminder that some things are better left alone, that some mysteries are better left unsolved.